From the late 80s to the mid-90s, Alan Conway, a sometime travel agent and conman from Harrow, impersonated film director Stanley Kubrick.
Alan Conway at that time was just a person who was another Joe Bloggs, Joe Doe. I was just one of a million people living in London. But then I realized I didn't have to be. And I went on stage and played my role. I was in London and I wanted to see a show. It was a remake of Rose Tattoo. And Julie Walters was in it with Patricia Hayes. So I went to the box office. There were no seats at that time. And I said, look, I don't want to throw my name around, but I'll tell you who I am. I'm Stanley Kubrick, and I very much like to see the show tonight. Have you got a single seat? Yes, we certainly have a single seat for you. Would you like to see them afterwards? I said, sure. So I saw the show, and then a man came just at the finish, took me to their dressing room, and we chatted for half an hour about what she's doing. She would like very much to work for me, because she knew a lot about my films. I'm sorry, his films. And so did Patricia Hayes. She said, I'd love to work for you. I said, well, I'll think about it. And I walked out into the grey night. And as far as they're concerned, they met Stanley Kubrick. And I may be doing something for them. And I got a big buzz.
Alan Conway's great stroke of luck was, not luck probably, deliberation, that he picked a man whose image was very little known to the rest of the world, because Kubrick had an almost obsessive desire not to be photographed by people, even his own camera crew.
The moment I had a few vodka and tonics in me, Mr. Kubrick was around. And that was all over the world.
It was in the summer of 1993, in a West End restaurant called Joe Allen's, that Frank Rich, the theater critic of the New York Times, was having supper with his wife, with a Hollywood producer, and with a tennis correspondent of another Washington newspaper, when suddenly a man detached himself from a group at another table.
And I just turned around, I heard their American accent. And of course I had an American accent as Kubrick. And I just turned around and said, where do you come from? And not like that, because I'm Alan Conway now. But what I did say was, near enough, where do you come from? And they said, from New York. New York! My God, where in New York? And we started talking.
And he introduced himself, having obviously heard what they were talking about, as Stanley Kubrick.
And he said, Stanley Kubrick, I've been wanting to meet you for 25 years. I said, well, here you are. And we met in London.
Now, you might think that two hard-bitten journalists and a Hollywood producer would have been somewhat skeptical, and up to a point they were, but they were sufficiently interested and flattered, I think, by the contiguous celebrity of this man who'd appeared out of nowhere and said he was Stanley Kubrick, to make inquiries the next day and eventually to write an article that didn't exactly say that they'd been taken in, but nevertheless cast certain doubts on this man. And of course I quite quickly discovered when I telephoned Stanley Kubrick that he had been nowhere near Joe Allen's. But to my surprise, about a couple of weeks later my own telephone rang, and a man claiming to be Stanley Kubrick began to engage me in conversation. And out of journalistic interest and perhaps a little mischief-making, I led him on, and it was Alan Conway, trying to tell me all about his life as Stanley Kubrick, where he lived at that time in Hertfordshire, his family, his film plans, etc. And, you know, he got nearly every detail wrong.
It was no surprise that Conway failed to deceive a Kubrick expert, but a singer and vocal impressionist proved a softer target.
I met a young man who really did believe I was Kubrick, a gentleman called Joe Longthorne.
Grab your coat and get your hat. Joe was doing a summer season at the BIC in Bournemouth, and one night Tony Hardman, the director of entertainment for Bournemouth Council, brought Dora Bryan and Stanley Kubrick, Alan Conway, backstage and introduced them to Joe.
We met in Joe's dressing room, and Joe really tuned into me.
Joe was eager to get a season in Vegas. Obviously that's where he was. As any artist really, it's a pinnacle of their career, than getting to Vegas like Tom and Engelbert did. So Alan had said he would help him in any way he could with his contacts overseas in the US to get Joe a season. So of course Joe was really excited, and yet at that point he had no reason to believe, Stan wasn't who he was meant to be. He said he was down in Bournemouth, he was looking for locations and extras for an upcoming movie he was about to shoot with Tom Cruise.
We became very good friends, because he did believe I was Kubrick. I know that.
What I knew of Stanley Kubrick, he was a bit of a recluse. He never sort of went out the house and one thing and another. So the next day I did a lot of investigation work on him, which I rang Pinewood Studios and asked to speak to someone in his office who I explained the situation to, and they said, I'll give you this number, ring this, and actually it was his residence. And I spoke to Stanley Kubrick's housekeeper. What he said to me was, is the guy from Harrow? And I said, yes, he is. He says, it's the same guy. He's been doing this now for about 3 years, and at some point they've had put the police on him when he was becoming a real annoyance. So we were just, it was intrigue then, who was this guy, and what can we do to find out who he is? Alan Conway, by this time, was back in London under the sort of auspices. He was, having production meeting for this up-and-coming movie, and we said, oh, that's great. We're up in London on Monday, actually. We're having lunch with our lawyer. Would you like to come and join and put all these proposals in place? But in the meantime, our lawyer had read a book on the works of Stanley Kubrick and did nothing but bombard him with questions for the whole course of the meal, which Stan was getting very, very hot under the collar and dismissing and being very vague in his answers. But at the end of the meal, when the maitre d' brought the cheque, I just nodded over and made sure it landed up in Alan Conway's lap. And instead of pulling what we thought a gold American Express card or a Diners Club out, he pulled like a green access card and scuttled off to the cashier's office to pay. Then when we sort of said our goodbyes in the doorway, the lawyer and I went back inside under the excuse I'd left a bag, went to the cashier's office and actually said, could I have a look at that credit card shit? And that's when we knew his name, Alan Conway.
I don't think I ever wanted to hurt anyone. I certainly didn't do it financially or anything like that in a criminal way, but yes, I suppose I did let a few people down.
We now know that Alan Conway had a string of criminal convictions stretching back to the 1950s for obtaining money by false pretenses, theft and gross indecency. According to Kubrick's widow, Christiane, Conway had also obtained sexual favors from young men in his guise as Kubrick.
Stanley was concerned about Alan Conway, not simply because of the fact that Alan Conway might get goods and services by writing the name Stanley Kubrick to the hotel bill and so on, which he did, but also from that fear that your identity is being taken away from you.
It sounds crazy, but that's what happened. I drew a great deal of strength from him. And I really did believe I was Kubrick. When I walked around this city, I believed I was Kubrick. I'm Alan Conway now. Sad. Sad. But I enjoyed being Kubrick. Great part for anybody to ever have. Who knows? If they make a life story of Kubrick, they may invite me. You never know.
In an ironic twist of fate, it is Conway's life that is now attracting filmmakers' attention, as 2 recent articles about him have been optioned for the screen.
I would be surprised if, A, much money changed hands to option those 2 articles, And I would be even more surprised, although who knows what the crazy film industry does, if anyone put a large sum of money into producing a movie called I Was Stanley Kubrick's Double.
Jealousy, obsession, fantasies.
He glanced at me.